Greetings, family. Welcome to the African Exodus show. I'm your host, Tony Cherie, here to you with a new video. This is the Conspiracy to Erase a Nation segment. This entire segment is taking material from a book that I wrote earlier this year called Conspiracy to Erase a Nation. The book goes into detail about how the real nation of Yasharel was not inside of Palestine or inside the so-called Middle East, but was actually inside of East Africa. The link to the book is inside of the description. If you would like a free mini PDF version of the book so you could review it yourself, you can also download it from my Patreon or also my Telegram. The links to both are in the description. We talked last time about the Hebrews of East Africa, and now we're going to talk about the Hebrews of West Africa. So this one is very interesting to me personally because, of course, the connection as far as closeness, as far as time, as far as distance between West Africa and East Africa is completely different, meaning the people, the Hebrews who were driven all the way to the West would have had to go a long way in order to get on that side of the continent. And because of that, we have to try to understand why. As we've spoken about, the Bantu dispersion seems to be the way from which many Hebrews who are coming out of East Africa, coming out of ancient Yasharel, are basically spreading to different parts of Africa because, as we know, the Bantus themselves spread literally all over the continent of Africa. Similarly, you see a relationship between those Hebrews who are leaving from East Africa, and you see a relationship with the Bantus to the point where many people who we can identify as being Hebrews are also Bantu speakers. So that's very interesting in itself. So we're now on the western coast of Africa. There's a number of tribes, again, who would probably fit the standard or fit the criteria as being Hebrew. As I said in the last video, one of the things you want to look for is an origin story that's pointing to this Ethiopia region. When people have that origin story, they're telling you, even if they don't know, that they're probably of Yasharel. Obviously, also you want to look for cultural, linguistic connection to the original Hebrews. And also you want to look to a people who are going to, unfortunately, have a paganized version of Torah practices that have been paganized over time. So these are all testaments to the fact that these people would have been the original Hebrews. Now, one study that I was able to find that was very interesting is a study that found that the Yoruba were actually 99.9% genetically identical to the Igbos, the Akan, and the Ga-Dangme. So let's read from this article. It says, Adobwale et al. Made the shocking discovery that whereas there was 99.9% within population variance, that between population variance was less than 0.1%. This means that Yorubas, Igbos, Ga, and Akan are 99.9% similar as populations, while within each of the groups there are differences and variations between individuals as high as 99%. One Igbo may be 99% variant to another Igbo, or one Yoruba to another Yoruba. In addition, these four ethnic groups have a long history of trade and other interactions, and they all speak languages belonging to the Niger Kordofanian group. As noted by Cavalli Saforza et al., the genetic relationship observed in West Africa indicate that major migrations and admixtures occurred within the region in earlier times. It is important to point out that despite the small amount of genetic differentiation in the sample as a whole, it was possible to distinguish between the groups from each country using a hierarchical AMOVA model and a dendrogram algorithm. So what this says to me, at least, is that these groups likely came to East Africa in a singular location, were likely a part of the same group at one time, although they later on branched off and obtained different types of practices, differentiations in language, but still from the same roots. So let's go through some of them individually. We're going to start with the Ashanti. A lot of overwhelming evidence that the Ashanti are Hebrew. In fact, there's an entire book about that I read, and the book goes into a lot of details. The book is called The Hebrew Heritage of Black Africa, and it's an interesting book because it was written by a Jewish person and also a man who I believe is a Hebrew Israelite. So they both combined in order to make the case that the Ashanti are actually Hebrews. Now, a lot of things in Ashanti point to their Hebrewness. One in particular is the Ashan T. Ashan is a Hebrew word. In fact, it is a tribe that was inside of Yahuda that was named Ashan. And the T part inside of West African languages is actually a way to say essentially the children of or the son of. So when the people say that I'm Ashanti, again, that Ashan is Hebrew, I'm a son of Ashan, pointing to the fact that the Ashanti likely originated inside of a town or a part of the tribe of Yahuda. But again, I said we have to look for the identifiable markers. One of the big markers is an origin story that's going to point to Ethiopia. So I'm reading from Conspiracy to Erase a Nation. It says the Hebrew identity of Ashanti has long been a topic of conversation. Joseph J. Williams in Hebrewisms of West Africa documents historians such as Andre Arkson in his assertion that from Ethiopia, Middle Egypt, and Central Sudan descended the Ashanti and the tribes known as Bantu. So this is very important to emphasize, from Ethiopia, Middle Egypt, and also Central Sudan. It goes on to say, similarly, Sir Harry Johnson was of the opinion that according to their language relations, the Ashanti group of Negroes once came from Niger north of Yoruba land and Borgu country. Lieutenant Colonial Makwa Ferryman insisted that Borgus claim relationship with the Bornas and the Bornas are located in the south of Lake Chad. There is a far-reaching indication of the possible origin of the Ashanti, providing verification of a collective journey from the Nile Valley. So Professor Roland B. Dixon of Harvard said that the oldest strata in Africa are represented by the Mongoloid, that is round-headed, low-skulled, broad-nosed, and Proto-Australoid, that is long-headed, low-skulled, broad-nosed types. Speaking of the later classification, Professor Dixon calls attention to the fact that this type appears as an inconsiderable element in the Abyssinian Plateau and among the Ashanti of West Africa. Professor Dixon concluded that the Ashanti seem to be quite comparable to the Lake Chad group in the Sudan. This Negro immigration, he added, was in part a westerly drift from the Chad now area, and in part a direct southward movement from the Western Sudan and the Sahara borders, forced by the expansion in the Sahara region of the Caspian peoples who have poured into North Africa since very early times. Also, Steve Jacobs, he lists inside of the Hebrew heritage of Black Africa a number of different characteristics and observations that have been made about the Ashanti, including, number one, the Ashanti are an ethnic mixture of peoples of West Africa, the ancestral home of most African Americans, obviously. The Ashanti are closely related to the Fanti, Yoruba, Sudanese, and more distinctly to Bantu, whose combined population stretches fully across sub-Saharan Africa. So this goes back to that reality that the Bantu dispersion likely was the dispersion of the Hebrews and going into West Africa, who were included among the Bantu. The Ashanti tribe appeared to have migrated and later pushed westward by alien white invaders of European origin known as Berbers and Arabs. We talked about this already. The Ashanti appear to have spread from Chad, now region of Northeast Africa. And number four, the Ashanti and related peoples live in the very region near the west coast of Africa from which most Black African slaves were captured and transported. Hence, they are the ancestors of most African Americans today. And by the way, that's really much the case if you are from Jamaica. You definitely are Ashanti. There's a number of other Caribbean countries. I think Haiti also has a number of Ashanti heritage, and also many Ashanti were brought to North America. And so, yeah, a lot of us have Ashanti heritage. Now, going on to the traditions of the Ashanti that show their Hebrew attributes, I'm going to read from, again, Conspiracy to Erase a Nation. Culturally, the Ashanti have many Hebraic traditions as well. Similar to the Hebrew word for the law of Moses, Torah, in Ashanti culture, the lawgiver is referred to as Poro. The name of the god of the Ashantis is supreme being known as Enyame, to whom Saturday is dedicated. In addition, Williams, talking about Joseph Williams, lists a number of Hebrew feats of the Ashanti culture, including religious dances, the use of a man, vow value, a patriarchal system, the authority in a stool or chair, endogamy, cross cousin marriages, familial names, exogamy, marriage rites, uncleanness after childbirth, the purification ceremony, menstrual seclusion, serial ablutions, and loanwords of Hebrew origin. Williams also noted Ashanti customs which were Abyssinian, citing Edward T. Edward Bowditch. The Ashanti is never presumed to speak, but through his ministers or interpreters, who invariably repeat his ordinary observations, however audible with the Abyssinian exordium, hear what the king says. In addition to prefix Sai or Zai, the name of Ashanti kings, or a vestige of the Abyssinian Za or Zo prefix of shepherd kings, or the original Ethiopians. He also discusses that the Ashantis, like the Abyssinians and ancient Egyptians, never fight at night, not even after sunset, whatever advantage they may lose. The Ashanti also never fight on Saturday. This is even closer to Hebrew tradition than that of the Galas of Ethiopia, who never fight on Friday. Galas, by the way, are the Oromo, who I've told you all are the Hebrews of that particular region. So Jacob also talks about the Ashanti and the Bantu connection. It says scholars believe there's a common origin for the Ashanti and Bantu peoples. They both came, it is thought, from the northeastern part of the African continent. The Ashantis eventually migrated to the west coast through parallel and the southern edge of the Sahara Desert. The Bantus, by contrast, moved mainly to south, so that today they occupied nearly the entire southern half of the continent, from the Congo Republic in Zaire on the west to Mozambique, on the east and southward to the very southernmost tip called the Cape of Hope. Ashantis are far from the only Bantu culture with a plenitude of Hebrewisms. However, what makes their case study different is the fact that Islam never gained influence over the Ashanti, either socially or politically. Meaning, inside of many Bantu cultures, many people could claim, who want to say that no Bantus are Hebrews or some Bantus aren't Hebrews, they could push back and saying, well, yeah, you have some Hebrewisms in your culture, but you got that not from the Bible, you got that not from the Hebrews, no, you got that from Islam. That's how they would push back. But the answer that the Ashantis would say is no, the Islamic military campaigns did not have that effect on our culture. So how else are you going to attribute the Hebrewism on the side of the Ashanti culture? You can't. So we're now going to talk about the Yoruba. Something very interesting about the Yoruba is the name Yoruba. And when I found this part out, I was like, wow, how did I miss that? So Yoruba, what do you think that sounds like inside of the Bible? Well, Yoruba sounds very similar to Jeroboam. Jeroboam, if you don't know, was a king of Yasharel, basically during the split of Yasharel from Yehuda, and also from the split between the other 11 tribes. Meaning the Yoruba likely come from a faction that come from those 11 tribes. Again, Yoruba, Jeroboam. So Yoruba is a Hebrew word. So reading from Conspiracy to Erase a Nation, this is according to the Yoruba's origin story, the tribe originally migrated from the Nile Valley, similar to what's been said about the Ashantis. This is confirmed as Yoruba culture has many similarities to ancient Egyptian culture. In addition, Yoruba religious tradition of Aduwa teaches that the ancestors of the Yorubas emerged from Egypt, not Arabia, as it has been speculated, leading some scholars to conclude Yorubas were Coptic Christians from Egypt. The Hebrewisms in Yoruba culture include circumcision, the division of tribes into separate families, and very frequently into the number 12. Of course, this is a reference to the 12 tribes of Yasharel. Sacrifices with a sprinkling of blood upon the altars and doorposts, similar to Passover. A specified time for mourning for the dead, during which time they shaved their heads and wore soiled or tattered clothes. Belief in demon possession, purification rituals, among other cultural feats. Okay, now we're going to talk about the Ewe and the Gebe. So this is interesting to me because, you know, I'm in Ghana, obviously. So the Ashanti obviously are here. Obviously, we're going to talk about the Ga very soon. The Ewe are also here. And it's interesting because Ewe people, at least from what I've been talking to people around here, they kind of are looked down on. by many people inside of this country, which again, this goes back to the perverse nature of colonialism, divide and conquer. You have a lot of people who don't know their real identity inside of Yah, their bloodline going directly to the tribe 12 of Yasharel, and even people who they regard as their enemy or they regard as lesser than them having that exact connection. Imagine if in a country like Ghana or in a country like Nigeria or a country like Togo, we have multiple Hebrew descendant tribes who are sometimes warring against each other or sometimes just looking down at each other. Imagine if they all knew, first of all, we are not inferior. First of all, we are not the downtrodden. We are not the least of these. We actually were from the actual tribes of Yasharel. Imagine the unity that would be felt amongst them. So this is why I encourage everyone, particularly wherever you are in the diaspora, wherever you are, if you're on the continent, when you have this truth, share it because it can heal, I believe, a lot of the wounds of colonialism. Now, it says that Ewe, talking about their language, Ewebe, is a part of the Gebe language cluster, which comes from Ethiopia, along with the Jin of Togo, the Aja of Togo and Benin, the Fan of Togo and Benin, and the Florafera of Togo and Benin. They belong to a member of the Kwa family of Sudanic languages. Remember, I told you all about those Sudanic languages, which is a subfamily of the Niger-Congo family of the Congo-Kordofonian language family of Africa. The Ewe are said to have left Ethiopia due to slave raids, where their community members were being sold as far as India. So this is very significant because this points us to the Arab slave trade. The Ewe essentially left the Ethiopia region during the Arab slave trade, as that's when many Africans were being sent throughout the eastern part of the world. And we know transatlantic slave trade, that's the western part of the world. So the Ewe, along with the Gebe, including the Aja, Fan, and Ga-Dangme, descend from the Yoruba. Now, this is something that a lot of people probably don't know. Yes, they all have their origins in the Yoruba. So again, these tribes descend from the Yoruba. You're going to see these Hebrew connections just continue the more that you dig into this, where the interrelatedness between the Ashanti, the Yoruba, the Ga, you're going to see this interrelatedness repeat because, again, these are all the same people coming from the actual tribes of Yasharel. So it also goes on to say that the Ewe migrated from Ketu, a Yoruba town in modern Benin. Some Gebe returned and founded the Aja kingdom of Alada, Wahada, Popo, and Jakin, and later the Fan kingdom of Dahomey. In the early 18th century, that became a central location of the transatlantic slave trade. The Wahada or Waida kingdoms is notable for being a variation of Yahuda, and is even labeled Kingdom of Judah in the 1747 map published in England. So, of course, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this map. So this essentially points to the Ewe probably being from the tribe of Yahuda, the fact that they adopted this name for this particular place. So let's go on. We're going to talk about the Ga-Dangme. The Ga-Dangme, they have an interesting oral history, again, all pointing to Ethiopia. This is the commonality. It says, according to the Ga-Dangme oral history, the group migrated to Ethiopia's Gondar province, where the Blue Nile originates. The Ga-Dangme word for high priest, Nai Wu Lomo, even means priest of the Nile. Imagine this. So this is from Dr. Ni Akakar Mensa. He gives further details about this oral history. It says, in 640 BC, the Assyrians attacked the Ga-Dangmes again while they were in Ethiopia. From Ethiopia, they traveled through southern Sudan and settled for a period of time at Same in Niger and even to Ilef in Nigeria. They migrated again in 1100 AD and settled at Dahomey and later traveled to Hutsi and Togo, where they stayed briefly. From Hutsi, the Ga-Dangmes traveled to the eastern banks of the river Volta. From there, they crossed the Volta River at a place between the old Kongpong and Akuse and established settlements on the plains of Taglogo, where they lived till 1200 AD. Later, the Ga-Dangme migrated to the plains of Lolobor, between the Lovor and Osukudu hills. The Shai occupied a settlement in Shai Highlands. the descendant of Eri, son of Gad, or believed to have been founded in Enri Kingdom around 900 AD, of the southern eastern and parts of the midwestern Igbo land and Nigeria, with other tribes of Levi, Zebulun, Ephraim, and possibly more. In the books of Numbers, the Bible had made extensive references to the children of Yasharah, what to include Gad and Dan and their children in Numbers 1 through 54. Ga-Dangmes also have Hebrew customs of circumcision, the Homowo festival, which is similar to Passover, Dagme's proverbs, which are also similar to Hebrew proverbs, as well as their Hebrew names are also documented by Mensa, including from the Old Testament, Hikole, Amasa, the Jane or Jane, Ammon, and Ashal. Okay, so moving on to the Igbo people. So similar to the Yabir of Somalia, who we spoke about last time, the name Yabir is Hebrew because the real word for Hebrew is actually Ibri, Yabir, Ibri. Same thing with Igbo. Igbo, Ibri. Igbo in itself is Hebrew. Going back to conspiracy to erase a nation, the traditional Igbo religion, Odiani, has a supreme being called Chukwu. Chukwu is the source of all things. He's invisible, genderless, also referred to with male pronouns, and is benevolent. He also punishes evildoers and evil deeds, but rewards good deeds. There are also lesser spirits called Akbara, who, similar to angels, can be approached. There's also Igu Oro, the Igbo festival that is very similar to Passover, where animals are sacrificed and blood is smeared on doorposts, trees, roadways, feet, hands, and earlobe as a seal to ward off evil spirits. In addition, Igbo eating patterns resemble those of the Hebrews. Eating pig is forbidden and considered filthy. Though male infidelity is frowned upon, it is considered an abomination when a woman commits adultery. Women who are accused of adultery are often taken to a community's central place of worship, where she is administered an oath, similar to the oath of drinking bitter waters of the Hebrews. However, the woman is to eat a kola nut from the ground that was prayed over. In addition, premarital sex, homosexual acts, and bestiality are all considered abominations. Now, I got a comment on my last video asking the question, how is it that African Americans could be Hebrews when we are literally a mixture of so many different cultures, so many different tribes, not just from West Africa, by the way, also from Central Africa. And even at some points, the transatlantic slave trade was geared towards Southern Africa at certain times. So how is it that we could know that we're Hebrew? Well, let me first say that I'm not one who believes that only people who were descended from Hebrew were taken in the transatlantic slave trade. Yes, I do believe that the people who planned the transatlantic slave trade, who we've spoken about previously, that those people who were expelled from Spain during the Spanish Inquisition sought after the people who were the actual Hebrews and planned it to do just that. Same thing with the Arab slave trade. Again, the Arab slave trade was a collaboration between Arabs and also the Berbers, who also had that role of planning a trade that was going to specifically target Hebrews. However, I do not believe that only Hebrews were taken in the slave trade, because we have to also keep in mind, same thing with the Arab slave trade, this goes beyond just trying to target a group. There's also other factors that are at hand, such as greed, such as capitalism, trying to get as much of a product as possible. You have to remember the slave trade started off small but grew immensely. The ability to fill the orders, or I'm trying to think of the term, the ability to fill the demand was so great in the slave trade that literally even people who were originally collaborating with the Europeans in order to enslave other African tribes, the demand became so great that literally Europeans were taking anyone. They didn't care if you were working with them previously. No, they had no discrimination. They were trying to get as many Africans as possible. So that being said, no, I do not believe that only Hebrews were taken in the slave trade. However, if you know anything about the transatlantic slave trade, the fact is that these groups were so immensely mixed up that it's like impossible that you can't have at least one of these Hebrew tribes, especially when I've just told you a number of Hebrew tribes, including the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Ashanti, and the Ga and the Ewes. Like these tribes, which I'm going to read to you, were specifically some of the most targeted in the slave trade. And the idea that you do not have at least one ancestor from one of these tribes and you are a descendant of the transatlantic slave trade, where literally the people of the tribes were taken to multiple slave castles mixed in with different groups. There was no complete separation, like, oh, we're only keeping people from these tribes here. No, literally African, they completely mixed everyone up, put people on slave ships and sent them off. For that reason, again, I think it would be highly improbable for you to be a descendant from people from who were taken in the transatlantic slave trade and not have Hebrew lineage. But of course, can I prove that? No, these are not things you can prove. It's just common sense to me when you look at the composition of the people who were sought after. So let's read more about that particular aspect with the diaspora. Now, it's important to emphasize that initially when the slave trade began, the Portuguese, again, who I have said, the same people who were expelled during the Spanish Inquisition, just a few years after the Inquisition, that's how soon it was. The people who had converted to Christianity, who were identified as being Sephardic Jews, just a few years after they were forcibly converted to Christianity, the slave trade begins. How is that a coincidence? Please explain to me. So just a few years after that conversion, you start having the Portuguese going out and looking for Africans who they're going to take to Europe. And initially, they were actually going out and looking for Africans themselves. They were actually doing the handiwork, but they realized very quickly that, oh, wow, we don't have the capacity to trap these people. We don't have the capacity to get these people, particularly the terrain inside of Africa, the climate, the conditions, they were not the best people. They decided to actually go out and do that work. So for that they decided to do is to find African tribes who are willing to collaborate with them in order to trap other Africans, capture them, and basically sell them to them. Now, it's important to emphasize, some people say, oh, Africans sold Africans. Obviously, it's more complex than that. We have to remember at that particular time, this is prior to colonialism, there was not a unifying identity throughout all of Africa. It was not like, oh, you black men, I black man, oh, we were brothers. No, that was not the common feeling. Instead, people found their identity with their tribes, because everyone's, pretty much black that they encountered. So there was no particular affinity for skin color. Also, just like different tribes will war against each other and have always warred against each other, that means that when you war against one tribe, you're probably going to take captives. And many times during the slave trade, they were selling the people who they took captive inside of different wars. They were selling them to the Europeans, starting off with the Portuguese. So that's important to emphasize, because you're going to see the Portuguese somehow be able to convince a number of tribes to participate in an international slave trade. What did they know about the slave trade? I'm sure they did not know the depth of it, but still a horrible act to participate in. So let's read some of the kingdoms what were participants in the transatlantic slave trade. Let's see if you recognize any of them. The Ashanti, the Fon of Dahomey, the Yoruba Empire of Oyo, were all solicited to supply slaves to the slave trade. Slavery was a common feature of most African societies, although not as dehumanizing as chattel slavery, as people enslaved still had rights. Initially, the pool of Africans were war captives, people from rival tribes, or people who were indebted. As demand and pressure from Europeans grew, raids and warfare would be specifically conducted to meet that demand. Thus, the system of slavery encouraged warfare to produce captives for trading and stimulated an increase in slavery in Africa. 90% of the enslaved were sent to forcibly work in the Caribbean and South America. Only 6% were sent to work in the United States. The Yoruba, Igbo, and Fon were among the most enslaved. Now, how interesting is that? The Yoruba, the Igbo, and the Fon were among the most enslaved, but let's remember the Yoruba, the Fon, the Oyo, of the Yoruba, the Fon, and the Ashanti, those are the same tribes that were collaborators with the slave trade. So let's let that sink in. Whenever the Africans were solicited to participate in the slave trade, they were Hebrews, Hebrew tribes that were solicited to participate. I'm sure not knowing the demented plan to conquer other people who have their same bloodline, but they agreed and they did participate. But these same groups, who were also early participants with the Europeans, also became victims of the same slave trade. So let's read. The Fon people of Dahomey made up the largest proportion of slaves sent to sugar plantations in the West Indies, particularly to Haiti and Trinidad. The Igbo were primarily taken to Barbados, Haiti, Jamaica, and the United States. In fact, I think I remember TD Jake saying he is something like 100% Igbo or something. From mid 1600s to 1830s, the United States brought a large number of Igbos to Virginia and Maryland for tobacco plantations. It has also been hypothesized that about 60% of all African Americans have at least one Igbo ancestor. The Ashanti also make up a significant number of enslaved Africans in the slave trade, particularly in Caribbean nations, namely Jamaica. Even today, Jamaican names given to children, Adrinka symbols used on houses, Anansi stories, and the dialect of Jamaican patois all have roots in the Ashanti. There was also an early wave of Akan Ashanti people brought to South Carolina in the 17th century by colonists from Barbados. Both Marcus Garvey and his wife, Amy Ashwood Garvey, are of Ashanti descent. In addition, famed abolitionist Harriet Tubman was of Ashanti descent. Both Garvey and Tubman have been lauded as mogul figures by their followers. So interesting that two prominent leaders were also people who came from the Ashanti, two prominent leaders inside of the entire African experience, Harriet Tubman, Marcus Garvey, Amy Ashwood Garvey. So I want to also give you this chart right here that's going to just give you a breakdown, like where did the people who were at transatlantic slave trade, where can they be traced to? So you see a number of countries. Again, it's not just West Africa. You have the DR Congo, you have Angola, you have Guinea, Cameroon, Nigeria, Guinea, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Gambia, Mauritania, and Senegal, Benin, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Liberia, Sierra Leone, so Madagascar, Mozambique, Tanzania, I mean, obviously to a lesser extent on that side, but still people from all of these places, a lot of tribes we can say definitely are Hebrew. And please let me emphasize that these are the ones who we can look at and say that these people are Hebrew. I'm sure there are many more that are Hebrew that I just have not come across. And again, that's all for us to do, all of us who particularly are continental Africans who have that ability to get an oral history from your families in different places in the African continent, dig into your family history. That's the work we have to do. What are your traditions? Where is your origin story? Where do you come from? Do you come from Ethiopia? Where you taken or fled from a slave trade, the Arab slave trade? And what is your language? Like, what are your different customs? These are things that each of us have to dig in if we're going to figure it out. So I close off the book, and by the way, this is the end of the book. But I close off the book talking about the First Africa Baptist Church. I wanted to emphasize this, that there were pews, and many of you probably know this, but I'm just going to say it again. There were pews that were found inside of Savannah, Georgia, obviously in North America. And the pews had engraved into the wood Hebrew, Ethiopia, Amharic, Ge'ez, and ancient Aramaic. And I think that's very interesting, particularly the Amharic Ge'ez. A lot of people focus on the Hebrew and don't talk about the Amharic Ge'ez. Why was Ge'ez a language that would have been carried from West Africa all the way to the Americas? Well, that means that there was obviously a aspect of our origin story that goes to Ethiopia. So that was really it for this particular subject. We'll basically close this chapter as far as the book. From there, again, I'm continuing to do my research. I encourage you all to continue to do your research. I'll present my research as I find my research on this subject about the original Hebrews, the true Hebrews, about where they come from, not from Palestine, but from East Africa, and about the dispersion of Hebrews all over the African continent. This is something, Yah willing, will continue to study and present information to you on. But that is it for this video. I thank you all for watching, and Yah willing, I'll see you in the next video.